Hello, everybody. It's Ian Pratt. I'm the Peacemonger. It is Saturday, the 24th of January, and this is my second recording of the day. You're lucky, or maybe unlucky, depending on how you see it. I hope you enjoy it. I'm pleased to welcome John-Paul Stuthridge from Liverpool. John-Paul is 29 years old. He's a philosophy graduate, and John-Paul is the first person who has responded to my call to appear on the show to offer their views and thoughts on a foreign policy topic, hopefully with a peace focus. John Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you. And yeah, it is a privilege to be, if you like, the first non-expert that you have on the channel. So I don't pretend to put myself among the others that you've had so far, but hopefully something will be interesting that I have to say. So yeah, looking forward to it.
John Paul, expert is a vastly overused term in my experience, so don't worry about that at all. So I
Yeah,
think
that's true. Brexit talk stuff.
I often feel we're subject to the tyranny of expertise, where experts, tell us all these daft things, and too many people go along with their views. So fear not about that. So what's your central proposition then that we want to discuss today?
So the central proposition is the direction that Europe is going in terms of its relationship with Russia. And in Europe, I include the United Kingdom, of course, which we can both speak to a bit more in depth. And the way I see it, there are sort of two possible outcomes, and Europe, and including the UK, has to make a painful decision as to which way they want to go. Um, Either they restore relations to some degree, or
With
they
Russia?
collapse even further. Yeah, exactly. Or they collapse even further to rock bottom. If it's hard to imagine that they could be any worse. But if the war in Ukraine has taught me anything, it's that it can always get worse. Um, and so that's kind of the question I think to discuss. Not just between you and I, but that Europe needs to have very soon, because I don't see any serious attempt to make even the conversation about it. We see that like Meloni, Macron, and so on, they mention these statements that maybe it's time to talk to the Russians. Um, but as Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister, responded with, they just need to pick up the phone and call, but they won't do that. And so I'm wondering at what point will the Europeans be forced to make a decision? What will prompt them? Will it be a political resolution in Ukraine, if there is one? Or will there be some other, unforeseeable reason that might do it? We live in such unpredictable times, but I think it's good that we have these conversations. Otherwise, we just won't be familiar with the context and the topic, um, and I think it is the choice of peoples really to make this decision, not just the leadership.
Well, absolutely, because political leaders rarely consult ordinary citizens on what they want, it seems to me. But why do you think this is important for the UK? I mean, well, what do we lose
Um,
out? What do we lose out if we just carry on as we are now, just not talking to the Russians, which basically is the policy we've had for 12 years?
Well, I mean, it's a good point because I mean, we've had very little trade with Russia. I mean, how many times do you go into the store and pick up something that says made in Russia? Even if it's a Matryoshka doll, it's probably made in China. But I think I think it's important to remember or remind people that the United Kingdom has had relations with Russia for at least well, for about 500 years. And I don't think people are aware of the connections between the two people. Maybe you could describe these connections as elitist in one sense, um, but I think we underestimate just how vital Russia's place is in Europe, because it is a European country. There are many overlaps, historical overlaps. We've been For Britain, we've been in a kind of on-off relationship, almost toxic relationship, you might say. Um, but I think there are great cultural reasons to restore relations. Our people actually get on quite well. You know, as you'll know, if you're in Russia and anywhere in Russia really, and you say that you're British, the reaction is 90% of the time, maybe more, it's positive and it's warm. People go, "Oh, London, it's the capital of Great Britain," and all that, and they just start to ask you questions. They're like, why are you here? Not in a interrogative way, but just they're curious about our culture, and I think we should be a bit more curious about theirs, which I do think people are. Like when I returned from Moscow in 2024, the taxi driver that took me home asked me where I'd just been, and I said, "Oh, I've been in Moscow," and he was so surprised, but and curious. He was like, "Oh, what's it like?" And that's usually the first question, "What's it like?" And so I do think there is an appetite, at least, to be a bit more engaged, to not be so kind of blocked off from Russia. Not to give it any kind of special treatment, but to not have this really hostile environment which seems to infect our own domestic politics. For example, Keir Starmer, every PMQs or every meeting with workers, he gets the chance to say Putin, and that's it. Or that Russia is menacing our skies and cities and gets away with it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's got to stop, and that might just be the first step.
Yeah, no, I agree completely on that. I mean, Ksenia Sobchak, this kind of HISO type character, systemic kind of opposition type character, had this fashion brand. I think when I was out there about, oh, it's something like it's Russia's fault again or something like that. But just emphasizing the point that if there's any domestic crisis in the UK, the government, it's not just Starmer, the previous government as well, will find a way to kind of introduce the word Putin into it to somehow deflect onto, well, it's really his fault. And the Russia Today had that hilarious Christmas advertisement. I don't know if you ever saw it on X, where it's talking, making it parodying the fact that everything is blamed
Mm.
on Putin. It's quite
Yeah.
funny. You lived there for 2.5 years, right? And why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I first visited just as a tourist. This was in 2018. This was just after I graduated, and yeah, so I was already curious about Russia. I kind of had a a 2 or 3 year period before that of just taking an interest in Russian history, the Soviet Union, and the post 2014 political atmosphere. So I went in 2018 and then decided to move there because I just liked it immediately. It was it was very strange, different. If you're used to holidaying in Western Europe, when you go to Russia, it feels a bit more of a challenge. Language, for example. So I was there for January 2019 in Moscow for the first 3 months, and then I moved to Chelyabinsk, which is for those who don't know, it's a city in the Urals, the city of 1,000 lakes, they call it, not far from Lake Baikal. And and so I spent the next 2 years there, and then came home in 2021, just before everything changed, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you say not far from Lake Baikal. That may be true by Russian Russian
Yeah,
standards, but I think
yeah.
I think it's several thousand kilometers. Yeah.
Well, yeah, short trip for them.
I never got down to Chelyabinsk. I used to go to Yekaterinburg a lot, which is only about 100 kilometers from
Yeah,
Chelyabinsk, isn't it? But I never had a
yeah.
chance to visit. And you're teaching English there, right?
Yeah, teaching English, like for most young people who move there, it's the best profession you can get into, which is fantastic, really, because it's not necessarily full-time work. So you do get the chance to travel around a little bit and sort of live the lifestyle, like uh, kind of how local friends might do. And so that for me was a really warm sort of time of my life because and I would in one sense I would redo it again as like a memory because it was so enjoyable. That's COVID notwithstanding. But yeah, so it was an interesting experience.
And the summers are great as well, aren't they? Out in Europe, really, really long, warm
Yeah,
summer days. I recall that, very, very well. I mean, I agree with you on the taxi driver point because I had exactly the same experience when I used to come back from my from Moscow on business or with family on holiday. Would exactly be the first question that your black cabbies would ask you. Well, what's it like? And they were curious. And I think most of my professional or just local friends um, saying they're curious. I mean, the people just don't know, what Russia's like. I'm not saying Russia's a perfect country. I'm not saying the UK is perfect, by any means. But I mean, I think it's a far more pleasant place to be with warm people than we realize, and that in a way is a tragedy of the conflict that actually it's kind of shattered links between peoples. Because one of the good things that existed before the war started was twinning arrangements between cities, Coventry and Volgograd, Glasgow and Rostov-on-Don, Edinburgh and St. Petersburg, Moscow and London, and Perm and Oxford and that sort of thing. And all of these kind of good connections, it's just basic people to people, not earth-shattering strategic things, but just people to people connections have gradually been sort of shattered. And even though there's still a large Russian expat community in the UK, the possibility to travel between the countries has been largely cut off. I mean, you can fly by Dubai or Turkey if you want to, or Serbia, but it's very, 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 very difficult. I mean, yeah, how can we get back to something a bit more normal where we can just open up borders a bit? I mean, what steps do you think we need to take to sort of at least begin the process of rapprochement? I mean, obviously, assuming that the war ends, I mean, let's assume that some sort of ceasefire sort of takes place, in Ukraine. I mean, my prediction is that will simply solidify the kind of the hostile, unforgiving war between Europe and Britain and Russia. I don't predict that that's going to lead to any immediate kind of rapprochement between Britain and Russia. Quite the opposite. I mean, I think it'll be status quo, quite frankly, and we'll just be arming the Ukrainians to the teeth, getting ready for the next war with Russia. I mean, that's how I see it. But what step do you think we can take to kind of have a more graduated return to just engaging with Russia after the war ends?
it's a difficult one, really. And I do sort of, s- I'm inclined to believe the slightly cynical view that the outlined, or depressing view rather, which is that, and this is something that Professor John Mearsheimer talks about as well, which is that the most likely outcome is some sort of frozen conflict with poisoned relations on either side. Um, and this doesn't benefit anyone, obviously. And another point that I wanted to mention was that, from the British point of view, at least, it seems to me that most of the Russophobia that does exist has been top down. It's been imposed by political circumstances, essentially. Um, and so, one thing that we could do is a kind of campaign of awareness, for lack of a better description, an awareness of just how many common ties there are between the British and Russians. Um, I mean, I enjoyed your discussion with Alexander Mercurius not long ago on your channel, where there was a brief moment where you go through some of the connections between, say, literature or architecture. That Dostoevsky read Dickens, and it should be mentioned as well that Pushkin read Shakespeare, Lermontov read Byron, the Bolshoi Theatre and the department store at Jason was built by Scots. And so there are all these sort of fascinating cultural connections which most people don't seem to know. And more humorously, you mentioned Yekaterinburg. When I went there was a Marks and Spencer's in the department store, which was quite surprised to see. Um, and so I think, again, yeah, so discussions like these really help. And this is one of the reasons why I reached out, because I think for what it's worth, I'm just an ordinary person who does have these kind of connections, and it might intrigue other people to want to travel to Russia, even with the difficulties that entails, like indirect flights and so on. But it could be, all small steps are not wasted and they are useful. Um, and I think in terms of from a top-down perspective as to what the government might do, um, I think the sanctions have gone so far that it, I wouldn't say it's inevitable, but it does seem that even big business and corporates might say, actually, let's take off the sanctions on direct flight bans because it benefits us all. That we just sort of simplify ordinary citizens' lives, mostly our own, because European airlines would use Russian airspace to go to East Asia and so on. And so I don't see a full sanctions relief going back to 2014 or anything like that. But just being able to travel directly might prompt some sort of cultural exchange, as I've tried to outline.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely with you on that. What one thing, John-Paul, that I don't think is going to happen is that the government is going to have a plan for how to do this.
When,
And I
when
can
did they
say
ever?
that with a high level of confidence, yeah, having worked in the system for a long time, as you know. So I do think it has to be step by step. And I spoke to Tony Brenton, the former British ambassador to Russia last month, or maybe the month before. And his view, a bit like yours, was that the first movers will be on the business side of things. British businesses will want to re-engage with Russia just because it's a massive consumer market for us. I mean, it was huge even when I was there, even after the Ukraine crisis had started. I mean, the Marks and Spencer thing made me smile. I mean, that the franchise I think is owned by Russians. That's why they've not been able to close it down as a brand. I think that's why it kind of remains, and some other brands the same thing applies. But I think businesses will jump first before the politicians. But I kind of think that's the right approach anyway, because I think economics should come before politics anyway. I think economics, yeah, that sort of opening up engagement through business, British and Russian businesses working together, it tends to lead to very fruitful collaborations, people to people connections, and that sort of thing. You look at the Volkswagen experience in Kaluga when they one of the first movers to open up a car factory, after Putin came to power. I mean, that had a massive effect just on the local economy, on connections between Germany and Russia. It was actually pretty huge at the time, and I think that thing can be hugely beneficial. Likewise on flights. I mean, Aeroflot gains massively from overflights to China because basically because of the way the system works. I mean, they get the revenue from the overflight fees just because it's the state-run carrier. I don't know if that's why it's the case, but and Western carriers benefit from the much shorter route of being able to fly across Siberia. I mean, so it's an obvious win, and it's one of those sanctions, and it is a sanction where there's no reason to keep it in place if the war ends. Because actually it's commercially beneficial on both sides. It allows a gradual opening up of movement between Russia and Britain and other countries in Europe. It's just a no-brainer. But I also think that on the sort of cultural side, it makes it just and in the educational side, it makes sense as well. I mean, you mentioned Pushkin and Shakespeare. I mean, when I was there, we had the UK Russia Year of Culture in 2014, and there's a kind of famous portrait of Pushkin that was sent to the National Portrait Gallery, and the National Portrait Gallery sent a painting of Shakespeare to the Tretchikov, I think, gallery in Moscow. So I mean, these things, again, Russians love that cultural kind of collaboration. That there's something they really like, and it's easy to do. It's very very easy to do because it's something that people in the art sector in the UK like. They like, and it's not political, but it slowly kind of builds connections and between universities. I mean, there's been a wholesale shutting off of links between British and Russian universities. I mean, even during the Soviet period, there was academic connection between the UK and Russia and the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist now between the UK and Russia. It's quite bizarre. Like the High School of Economics, London School of Economics, and other kind of university partnerships that exist. So I think all of these steps are kind of before you've even touched the sanctions themselves, are things that are quite easy to sort of put in place. and which may actually be stimulated by. I mean, I think on the education sector that would need some sort of government. The government would probably want to have their fingerprints all over that, and probably would want to meddle in that. But I mean, that these are things that should be relatively easy to do. What's your view on the kind of sanctions glide path anyway, in terms of where we go with them? I mean, I'm not expecting you to have any expert view on sanctions, but just your kind of thoughts really would be interesting to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's good that you mentioned the sanctions on direct air travel because I think that it's probably the one that affects most people firstly. And I think it's one of the not to overstate it, but I think it's one of the most inhumane sanctions that we've had as well, the collective West has imposed because what is the real effect of this is that it splits families. Grandmothers who have maybe family in America or in Europe and they just can't afford the travel. They can't afford the 10, 12, 15-hour journey via Istanbul or Dubai or wherever. And if it's aimed to create like disillusionment with among the elites, then it doesn't bother them anyway because they can afford it. They can have special arrangements that we maybe
Private
don't even
jets.
know. Yeah, exactly. And so it also doesn't if the point of the sanction is to make ordinary Russian citizens feel uh, feel negative towards their own government. It doesn't do that. All it's just an annoyance. It's an expensive annoyance for everyone. And it's not just for Russians either. It's people who visit Russia. It's sort of assumed that this travel ban is to stop Russians coming over here when actually it's more often that it's us trying to go over there.
Yeah.
Because it is easier for us to go over there. The visa requirements are not so stringent in comparison. Um,
Unless you're me.
well, I can imagine, yeah. But still, you've had experience with that now, so I'm sure it's a doddle.
Yeah,
But yeah, you see the point. I think so. So actually, this is probably the pound for pound most impactful sanction that we could and realistically lift, and it would have the biggest effect on um, on the very first baby steps towards a kind of sensible trust towards each other, not so that the governments or anything fall in love again, but that they
yeah,
just have an adult understanding that okay, our citizens want to go there, we won't stop them, and yours come here and play by the rules, etc., mutually so, and
yeah,
it's all good. Um, And I think there
yeah,
is a precedent for that. The direct flights have been cancelled before. I think between America and Russia, for example, I think it was in 1981, after Czechoslovakia incident, the flights were sort of put on hold, and then about 5 years later, in 1986, they were restored again, Pan Am and Aeroflot. So there is precedent that this will happen. Now we're in the fourth year of the war. It might come soon. And so, as opposed to, as for the British government, you say they won't have a plan. Absolutely, they won't. But there is a view that I'm kind of that I'm inclined to believe, which is that America would probably do this first. Well, I'm sure they will do this first, and then
yeah,
once America does it, sooner or later, the Europeans, the British, probably quietly will just release a paper on the government website that lifts the sanctions, and there'll be no press about it.
yeah. No, you're spot on with that. I mean, the American. I'm quite sure the Americans will and already are starting to move first with this kind of dialogue that they've been maintaining with the Russians on not just on the Ukraine war, but on actually US-Russia relations. Yeah, and actually, during Trump's first administration, he was opening up sort of company to company links very, very quickly in 2017. It's just that quickly fell apart because of the CATSA Sanctions Act that was forced on him by the blob in DC. I mean, yeah, I agree with you. I mean, the other thing, of course, is that actually it's not just the air travel; it's the land travel as well. Because you look for the economic impact on, for example, there's an Economist or the FT, I think the Economist, an article saying that that the Finnish border towns have had big economic declines because they relied on sort of Russians coming across the border, which has all been cut off. And there's that kind of land-based travel movement as well, across from the Balts, and so on. I think that that's another kind of part of it as well. I think going back to the kind of the people to people thing. I mean, I think it is something that is annoying and expensive. And I've got Russian friends in London who have to go back and via wherever, Istanbul, whatever. But in general terms, it just makes it harder for Russian people to know British people because we're removing the possibility of them engaging by actually putting up an iron curtain, essentially. Which just in general must be an unhelpful thing to do because if you want to build mutual understanding, we need our people to meet each other and travel freely across borders and that sort of thing. So, for that reason alone, but I don't think. I think you're right that I think European countries will start to follow suit. The Italians definitely, Spanish probably, people like Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and that sort of thing. I still think we'll be at the back of the queue, like with the Poles and with the Balts. That the last to kind of move. I'm sorry, bitter experience tells me that yes, there will be a rush to re-engage, but it won't be from London. I just don't see that happening. But I mean, nevertheless, I think that the border thing, if the flights open up, I mean that there may be scope for that to happen. Let's see UK companies. I want to talk to BP and not just on oil and gas, but possibly as well. But I mean, I think the government probably will try and make it as difficult as possible for that re-engagement to take place. I mean, that's just I mean, when the Labour, I mean, I don't support any political party, by the way, but when the Labour Party came into power, I mean, in the absence of their own foreign policy idea, I mean, that they came in essentially trying to fix the problems of the UK, right? I mean, that was their mandate. They didn't really have any clear vision for foreign policy, but unfortunately, what that meant was that David Lammy decided that he could either just carry on doing what the Tories did as a status quo, he could do something different, and there's no political mood for that before the election of Donald Trump, or he could just be more extreme than the Tories, and he chose the latter. And so this government has actually been even worse, if that's possible, than the Tories on Russia. So I see no signs of that changing. Let's see, with Andy Burnham miraculously becomes an MP and then mounts a challenge against Keir Starmer. But yeah, who knows? I don't want to
Well,
kind of get a crystal ball out and gaze into it. But
yeah. Well, I mean, interestingly, I'm not sure many people know about this, although you probably do. Was that about last year, I think, like early 2024, the government secretly relieved sanctions on, say, some Russian banks, and there's no spotlight on it whatsoever. There's just a press release that details who the sanctions are lifted on, and there was a Russian bank, I can't remember the name of it. Um, and and I remember also not too long ago, about 6 months ago, one Labour minister in the Commons, House of Commons, uh, forget his name because they're all quite forgettable, to be honest, said that, and I quote, "We would like to have a relationship with Russia." I don't know whether I mean, you never know whether he's just speaking, just that's his personal opinion, or this is the line, this is the view, whether it's a view by the party or it's actually the state apparatus, which has its own kind of identity and functions as its own organism, the
yeah,
blob. Um,
yeah,
so although I agree generally that I have no faith in this government to do anything about it, there is still, I won't say hope, but there is reason to suspect that even they, as useless as they are, might do the sensible thing. Um,
yeah. The one tiny glimmer of hope I have is I'm not saying I like her or dislike her because I don't have a view, but I try and look at things in a rational way. Is on Rachel Reeves and her policy on international trade. Um, where it's very you look at the decision to agree the Chinese mega MC, which is ridiculous, frankly, that's been delayed this long because we want to expand our MC in Beijing, they want to expand their MC just get on with it. I mean, they spy on us, we spy on them, and we just have to manage the risks. I mean, that's just how I think about it. But
Mm.
it's just ridiculous that we've been holding it up so long. But anyway, the point is that Rachel Reeves has been quite clever. I mean, I think she's completely indebting us as a country and pushing up our taxes because she can't hold sway over the kind of securocrats. But on international trade, I think she does seem to have a plan, and I think that plan involves not having to choose between China, Europe, and the US on trade to develop, stronger trade relations with China in circumstances where we have a massive trade deficit with China, and we invest in China. So a double whammy of money leaving the UK, for China, big to invest in the UK. And she wants to kind of flip that and actually have a more obviously kind of balanced relationship where actually she needs investment and we're able to export more goods and we just accept the fact that Chinese goods like in vehicles and so on is an inevitability, but we need the balance sheet to kind of tally off at the end of every year, if that makes sense. So, and hence Keir Starmer's kind of visit to Beijing coming up, which I think is quite important,
Mm.
particularly at a time when Trump is increasingly wanting us to pick sides. The fact that Rachel Reeves's policy is explicitly that we don't pick sides in economic sort of and international trade is fundamentally sensible in my view. Um, Not a party political view, just a rational sort of analysis of the situation. Likewise with Europe, on the back of Brexit, wanting a closer kind of trading relationship, either for customs union, whatever, single market, who knows, in the future, I think makes eminent sense. I mean, I have concerns about the democratic deficits in Brussels and the centralization of powers. But I mean, why would we cut ourselves off from our biggest trading partner in Europe? I mean, it makes no sense at all. And with the US. But I mean, the reason that I have this tiny glimmer of hope is that actually, well, maybe at some point, a light will come from Great George Street, the Treasury kind of main building, and they say, well, actually, should we not just have a normal economic relationship with Russia as well? Policy. And that would be the rational thing to do in the economic strategic interest of the UK because of the size of the market, because of the low cost of Russian energy and how that would benefit us in circumstances where we have to ridiculously buy, US LNG at three times, what we pay for Russian pipe gas. But yeah, I'm not going to get too excited about that, John-Paul, because this is just far too rational and logical to make sense in Whitehall. But that I think that could start slowly to kind of turn the dial a bit, particularly from in the Treasury, about actually, well, if we're not going to hug Putin, but we want to do some engagement, well, the economics might be the simple place to start. After we've done those small steps that you were talking about, like flight routes, cultural exchange, people to people, education, and that sort of thing, which is just an absolute no-brainer, frankly, from my point of view.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And actually, yeah, it was. I think it was last year or 2024 even when Keir Starmer made that position known that they're not going to choose a side between Europe and America. And it was I think it was the first thing I actually agreed with that he said. There isn't many things, but that was one of them. Um, and and but this leads me to think and ask is where does that leave the in the event of a likely Nigel Farage-led reform government, whether it's 2029 or sooner, could that potentially threaten that economic common sense or that sort of geopolitical common sense to not choose a side? Because it seems to me that Farage does want to choose a side, and he's far more likely um, to be dependent on America and adopt essentially the same foreign policy,
Mm.
especially over Iran, over Russia,
Yeah,
over China. And I watched an interview with him yesterday with Bloomberg at Davos, and he was essentially towing the same lines that we should be skeptical of China, not trust them, that that America's our greatest and biggest important ally, special relationship, and all this. Um, and so, do you think if the British government was to change into whether it's a majority reform government or some sort of reform Tory pact, whatever, that that would threaten this trajectory that we hope for, i.e., um, a bit of global common sense as it relates to China and Russia.
Well, I've got probably three observations on on that. The first is that actually it's only really the Reform Party that said anything sensible on Russia-Ukraine war. Um, Although they've had, Nigel Farage was red-faced about having done that and kind of rode back and caveated what he said, but he was saying that Russia was provoked into it and all the rest of it, and some other kind of reform figure more recently has said something similar. We need to normalize relations with Russia. So that gives me hope that they will at the very least have a more realistic position. And let's be honest. I mean, you're right in terms of reform sort of being in lockstep with like the MAGA type movement and that sort of thing. You're absolutely right. But the Americans are looking to economically reset with Russia as well. So that would be my counterpoint to that critique. It does raise a risk that we're going to just follow batshit stupid ideas on Iran and that sort of thing. Of course, it does. But as it relates to Russia, I think actually no. I think they would go with the grain what the Americans are doing. The Americans are looking to reset with Russia. The second point I make is that what's happening in the UK isn't happening in a vacuum for what's happening on continental Europe in terms of a shift away from if you want to call them neoliberal, whatever you want to call them, the uniparty of the Lib Dems, the Labour, and the Conservatives, who all basically say the same thing on foreign policy, which is let's have more war, or let's have neither war nor peace. Let's just let Ukraine suffer between our unwillingness to fight a war and our unwillingness to have peace with Russia. I mean, that's how I've described it right from the start. It's an inability to choose war or peace, with Russia that has ended Ukraine in the dreadful situation that it's in. So that uniparty is a representative of that position, that blob, if you like, position. But the opposition to that manifest in reform. You can see that in Hungary, you can see it in Slovakia, Czech Republic, Romania, France, even Germany as well, AfD and all the rest of it. So I think in that general kind of pivot away from neoliberalism towards a more kind of uh, policy rooted in the national interest. I don't want to get into the discussion about whether some parties are racist or not racist. I mean, I absolutely hate racists, but I mean that foreign policy rooted in the national interest. Then I think actually what's happening with reform is consistent with that trend. That actually they're going to think about what matters most for UK interests, reducing the cost of living crisis. You know, reducing the cost of energy, reinvigorating our economies, reinvigorating our industrial base that's been ripped out really since the early 80s, as we know. And which actually, that theme of manufacturing is coming back on vogue now that globalization is losing its luster. So I think that again makes me think that reform is going to continue that trend of actually wanting to have normal relations with Russia because it's pragmatic to do so in economic terms. If that makes sense. And the third point is that actually one China. Well, I mean, China is this is going to be Asia's century, whether we like it or not, whether the Americans like it or not, and that would be one area in which it would be kind of foolish, I think, for reform to just toe the line with. In any case, Trump won't be in power if Farage got into power. So I mean that so it's a slightly academic point, but more likely to end up with a Vance or a Rubio yeah, if Trump hasn't done something completely bonkers that actually the Democrats have got back into power again. But again, that's way too far into the future. I mean, I think it would be daft for Farage to ignore that reality that it makes sense for us to kind of strengthen economic ties with Russia, and with China, in the future. So I mean that would be my kind of comeback, if you like on that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I would only suggest like two counter observations to the first 2 points, which was um, I think you're right about Farage that he has, well, since before, well, after 2014, he did make these common sense observations that it was NATO expansion and so on that provoked the war. But that, at least for now, that is kind of politically volatile for Farage personally, because anything to do with Russia in
Yeah,
even
yeah,
common sense terms, the mass media jump on it and say,
yeah,
look, we told you he's personally paid by the Kremlin himself. Um, and so I think that might explain why he has to sort of tread carefully with his statements that he's not pro Zelensky or pro Ukraine in any way, but
yeah,
he tries to give the appearance of balance. Um, so that would explain him. But there are some like Richard Tice who has been to Ukraine and as many times ended his tweets on X with Slava Ukraini, and so this might lead to an internal debate. But hopefully, in the case of someone like Richard Tice, his business acumen would lead him down the common sense route, which is really one of pure necessity.
yeah,
Um, and as for the point about the MAGA, whether there is a MAGA by 2029 or not, um, that is a fair point. Although I think it's also fair to say that MAGA is itself a bit split at the moment as to what the right approach to foreign policy should be. And the internal debates between those key MAGA figures and creators, content creators, is raging at the moment. Like it's going on a lot. Not to say that this will come overseas and influence our politics, but it does for me still seem a little bit unpredictable as to which way reform might go. Um, I actually think it's probably beyond political parties now. This is more going to be what choice is the British state going to do? Um, the kind of what's because so many of these decisions are, I wouldn't say they're made by like the civil service and so on, but there are institutions and agencies which essentially influence all the parties to go down a particular route, whether it's always in the national interest or sometimes when it isn't. And so yeah, generally I agree. I think it's hopefully the the glimmers of hope you've mentioned do continue over into all the parties, but I'm not going to put a bet on it, let's say.
well, yeah. Well, let's keep those glimmers alive. And actually, I would just finish. I'd say that there's a big difference between being in opposition and being in power. So I think that, and it's hard to predict, what Farage might do if he has the freedom of office. I mean, that freedom is obviously, circumscribed by the media, of course. But I mean, I think, he may feel more able to spread his wings on foreign policy if, it just the politics doesn't make sense for him to go to front foot on restoring Russia relations, frankly, right now. Certainly not while the war's still going on. But let's see if that would change if he got into office. But anyway, that was really enjoyed that discussion, John-Paul. Thank you so much for suggesting it, firstly, and for sort of braving up and coming to join me today. I've certainly enjoyed getting to know you. I hope you found the discussion stimulating as well.
No, absolutely, and thank you. I'm delighted you extended the invitation to just your usual viewers. And so yeah, I'm really happy with how the conversation went. I think we've actually got more to talk about. So maybe one day again we can
Yeah,
continue this conversation because
more than happy to continue on at another time. But for now, thank you so much, John-Paul Stuthridge from Liverpool, somebody who's actually met Russian people and lived in Russia, which is more than can be said for most politicians in Parliament right now. Thank you all for watching. As always, I'm Ian Perry, the Peacemonger. Do continue to support my work. I've only just got started, but I'm been overwhelmed by the support you've given me so far. Do like and subscribe this video. And as always, I wish you all very much peace.